I hope you can hear me well, absolutely everywhere, in the back as well. Okay, that sounds good. Let me briefly introduce myself, but also introduce the take that I would like to have today on the topic of AI in practical medical imaging. I'm Peter Kecskemethy, CEO and co-founder of Kheiron Medical. I'll introduce Kheiron Medical briefly, but what I would like to say when you look at this title, Practical Medical Imaging, I would like you to think about, okay, what does pretty much reality and dreams kind of, how do reality and dream separate in our lives in medical imaging when we're thinking about AI? And really that's going to be the focus of my talk. So how we're going to tackle that is thinking a tiny bit about the motivation. Should we really consider implementing and bringing AI into the medical field? What are the pros and cons? Is the technology really ready? What are our hopes and dreams? And you know, as a founder, I'm really falling into the category of having a lot of hopes about AI being impactful in this field. And then what is really the reality? And I think that's the most important thing for today to take home from this talk. So if there's any part that you would like to focus on and concentrate on, focus on how do we make anything real? And then off of that, what should be our focus on building the future? Okay. So just about Kheiron Medical, this is important background. We are basically a group of technologists and radiologists working together to improve patient outcomes. You'll see this is quite important to be multidisciplinary. You need the tech and you need the domain in order to have any kind of impact. And above all else, of course, we need to focus on patient outcomes. If we're focusing on anything else, the outcomes will be suboptimal. Of course, when we're thinking about patient outcomes, we can think about this directly, but also indirectly. Directly meaning we need to do better diagnosis, for instance, when we're talking about medical imaging. Indirectly, we really need to help the doctors and the system to perform and deliver patient impact better. So there's both ways of doing that, and I think the earlier comments were on efficiency. Efficiency does fall into that category. If you don't have good enough efficiency, you're not going to even have a working system. Okay, so just very, very briefly, what is sort of like the past and the present? I think we all know that there's a bit of hype and noise and maybe some fear from the domain and disillusion. There are quite a bit of confusion about, okay, when does AI work? How do I know that it works? Can I really bring it? Is it ready for diagnosing my patients? These are extremely important confusions and important questions that we need to tackle when we're talking to doctors, radiologists, pathologists, anyone. And then, of course, the challenges are technology, regulatory bars, and really the lack of clarity on all of that. And if you think about this, all of this is basically just educating each other. That's the only thing we really, really need to do. Besides, the tech is moving forward. Everyone is developing algorithms. But really what we need to do is to come on to the same understanding of, okay, how do we assess when something works? If we're all assessing correctly, then that's a very, very strong driver for the right algorithms to making it into reality, and for the right algorithms to making it into hospitals and impacting patients, including yourself. So I would say that the most important thing we need to do is just really get clear about all of this. So I'm really glad to be here and hopefully contributing a tiny bit to this. So very briefly, we'll run through a bit of the motivation. So first of all, when we're thinking about technology and diagnostics, medical imaging, what is important to realize is a lot of the development and a lot of the breakthroughs so far have been technological. So having the attitude of not incorporating new technology that helps us is not really what our past has been in the domain. So really also shouldn't be our future. We need to involve the technology as much as we can. And in fact, it's actually our responsibility to do so, right? If there's some technology that can bring any impact, positive impact for patients, we really ought to bring it in. But only if it really brings positive patient impact. If it's negative patient impact, of course, we need to be very careful about that. So At Kheiron Medical, we're focusing on really helping radiologists do breast cancer screening better, more efficiently, more accurately. So I'm bringing up a couple of examples of why it is really important to bring AI into breast cancer screening. So one thing is consistency and performance. There's a lot of room for improvement. Overly many patients are recalled. It's kind of like not really overdiagnosing, but akin to that. Also, quite a few of the cancers are missed. So clearly we can do a tiny bit better. There's room for improvement. There's also a huge staff shortage across the globe, especially in the specialist areas like breast cancer. So that means either you don't have a doctor that can diagnose and read your scan, or you have a doctor who is overworked, or you have a doctor who's not really specialized. So it's not, and that can happen quite a bit, and across most of the developing world. And the emerging markets, we can also see that just don't even have any screening program because it's impossible to build it up. There's no radiologists and doctors to do so. That's what I said. And then all of this, so kind of like accuracy limitations and kind of loss of trust in that. Also, a lot of the increasing costs that come from shortage basically lead to major systematic problems. And in breast cancer screening, what you see there is basically loss of trust in breast cancer screening. What you hear across multiple countries is, okay, it's really actually questioned, should we do screening for any kind of cancer? And breast cancer is really the forefront of that. If breast cancer is questioned, whether we should have screening programs, most likely we're going to have a lot of questioning down the line. Do we need to have it for lung, for prostate, etc.? So this is extremely important for us to tackle. But if we fundamentally touch these base points of shortage, efficiency, also the accuracy, so how we can do diagnosis, we can really build from the base up and rebuild trust. So these are all really important, and I think that's relatively easy to agree on. But I think the next question is why do we think about machine learning? And I'd just like to take you on a 1-minute historical tour, and that is just think about how extremely data-driven healthcare is. So if you think about from the really earliest developments to the latest developments in healthcare, basically absolutely everything is data-driven. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of lack of understanding, hopefully shrinking lack of understanding, but still there's so much we don't know. Hence, the natural way for us to tackle anything in healthcare is to do probabilistically, and in that way, I would argue that statistics is the natural language for healthcare, or at least for healthcare improvements. Statistics is also, I would say, the language of science, but I'm a statistician partially by my background, so I'm sure I'm biased to some degree. Anyway, so if we're thinking about statistics being one of the foundational blocks of moving forward in healthcare and development, it's relatively easy to see that machine learning is also a natural thing to apply. So machine learning is basically just using very complicated statistical models, using computer algorithms to train them fast and actually make them usable. And so basically it's just sort of a high-powered modern statistics in some ways. And what is really, really important and why we're having, I guess, CogX and a lot of the interest in AI recently is the recent developments in deep learning. And I would like to just very briefly touch on, I'm sure absolutely everyone knows what deep learning is, that's why you're here, but I would like to point out one really important aspect of deep learning that really, I believe, is the driver and the significance of everything we're doing. And that is feature learning. And basically what feature learning does is allows us to look at data and for the algorithm to find information in the data itself. So that means you don't need, for instance, an engineer to listen to a radiologist, try to distill their knowledge into code and kind of like lose a lot of information in that process. What you do is just look at the data, the algorithm itself tries to figure out how to use information in the data, and that way that's the only way we can really move beyond human understanding. Because if you do feature engineering as it's kind of like classical machine learning, what you fundamentally start with is the understanding of a radiologist of, okay, how cancer looks like in an image, right? So you really can't move beyond human capability in that sense. But with deep learning, we can actually find information in an image and have algorithms that understand information in images beyond what we have ever been able to do so. So that I think is extremely important. But I think we all know that the access to data, the access to GPUs, and the access to the technology have been major drivers recently. But I would also argue that in order for success to happen in medical imaging and generally in healthcare, we also need to work with the domain way more strongly than at the moment. You can see there's a lot of success in general data sets, in ImageNet and MNIST, etc. But really in the healthcare domain, not so much. And I believe the way to move forward with that, across that, is really to understand and bring in domain knowledge. So I'm sure you know deep learning is based on kind of like the mathematical modeling of a neuron into basically one component, one artificial neuron. Then when you put those together, that's kind of like an artificial neural network. But you put a lot of that together, that's basically a deep neural net, hence deep learning. So these are a couple of the examples of how deep learning has been used. Okay, object detection or facial recognition. And one of the known breakthroughs is when over ImageNet, we have seen multiple algorithms perform better than humans at some various tasks. And this is extremely important because it kind of like proves the point. This is the first sort of computer vision paradigm that has been able to do better statistically than humans. So, of course, all of that technological breakthrough and kind of like the academical success leads us to have really high hopes. Again, here I would remind you that all of deep learning is sort of based on a biological model, but it's very, very important to keep in mind that actually how the computer systems, the deep learning networks work, is entirely different from how the biological neurons work. We have very, very different capabilities and very different ways of looking at an image than computers do. So humans have sort of like strategic understanding. If you see kind of like an animal in a whitish background, you can sort of guess that that's sort of like an animal that lives in the Arctic. But a computer may or may not be able to do that. Depends on how you train the algorithms. So that's sort of strategic understanding. And kind of what the radiologist and humans can do is, what a computer can do is really look at absolutely every pixel, maybe look in the Fourier transform of the image, and look at images in all sorts of ways that we usually don't perceive information. And what you see here is really some of the thesis that we have. So when you have a single radiologist doing single reading, meaning a single radiologist looking at an image, you compare that with human understanding, so a single radiologist plus an AI algorithm looking at an image, you have a very, very different view because you have really a bit of overlap, a bit of redundancy. Okay, the human eye is looking at some of the information and the computer is looking at the same information. But fundamentally, really the computers are looking at different kind of information in the images. So, and this is extremely important to realize because when you want to deliver patient impact, you want to use as much information from an image as possible, right? If the information is there and we're not using it for the benefit of patients, we're really kind of doing a disservice. So I would say, I'm sure this is going to come up in the panel later on, but when we are assistive and when we are taking over human capabilities, this is very important to keep in mind. When do we want to be kind of meticulous? When do we want to be strategic? And really, I would say, again, this still stays with the hope part of my presentation. When you can find new information in images that was not possible before, and when you can really automate that, you really have a chance of sort of moving out of, breaking out of gravity, to having sort of this escape velocity. If you have this really good technology, you can move into a new era. You can really move into new ways of analyzing images. And I believe this is extremely important for us to keep in mind. So if we're thinking about, okay, what can we achieve with this? Of course, there's lots of automation, so removing boring tasks and things where efficiency can improve. We can really bring in consistency because, you know, a computer doesn't have to go to the loo, doesn't have to worry about any issues at home. But what really happens here is we can even build up a better understanding of healthcare, a better understanding of diseases, and have a positive feedback loop over between sort of imaging and research and imaging and research. Now, I would go into the next phase, which is reality. This is all very interesting and you know, all very positive, but what I would say is it's very important to keep in mind that we can always build a model for sort of like an isolated task and be very efficient and very successful with it. If you just have a bit of data and an algorithm and you build something, that doesn't mean it necessarily will work in reality. And there are actually a couple of real-world examples when this has been realized. So again, this is the most important part that I would like everyone for taking away. Fundamentally, building a proof of concept, for instance, in an academic setting is one thing. You can do it in maybe 3 months. Building something that has practical utility and patient safety, meaning any patient who comes in can have like a reliable chance of positively being impacted and not negatively, that's an entirely different level. And I would say that most of what we see here currently in AI and medical imaging is the confusion between that. When is an algorithm really ready for practical deployment? So at Kheiron, we pulled together a checklist on how do you really assess your AI algorithm, or when you're in a hospital, how do you check whether something is ready, whether I should deploy something? And you can see these blocks, and going down is basically how you succeed. On the top is even the direction the right direction? Should I consider this for my application? Is it kind of like the right workflow? Then is it robust? Meaning, okay, is it safe? Is it actually just like a proof of concept, an academic proof of concept, or is it something that I can rely on in my work? And then down the line, it's also important that you have the right kind of collaborator that you're working with who want to kind of like continue development along the path. So I think I only have about a minute or 2 minutes. Thank you. I would say I'm happy to report that we have at Kheiron, we have some hope that we have escaped or achieved escape velocity. We have algorithms that moved a bit beyond what we would expect to be the performance of specialist experts. We have moved quite a bit beyond what was previously possible without deep learning models. And I would just briefly run a video for you of how much how far we have come for understanding the images that we're working with. What you see is basically a computer-generated, sort of like GAN-generated, generative adversarial network-generated set of images as we are traversing hyperspace, if you know what that means. Basically, all of these images are normal medical image resolution, but also what you can see is the computer is generating all the artifacts, absolutely everything all the dirt that you would expect in a medical setting, and this is extremely important. It is extremely important for us to, for instance, move away from diagnosing patients to be positive when there's just an artifact. That's really not what you want to do. It's also extremely important that you encapsulate all the variation in your input data, all the images that can possibly come to your algorithm in terms of inputs. You need to be able to handle. If something is what we call out of distribution, or something that we can't handle, or the algorithm sort of says, okay, I really don't know what's going on. Either we need to be able to communicate that, or we really, really need to be able to sort of move beyond and try to figure out how do we make decisions in scenarios where we have low information. So I would just say we did a clinical trial with trying to really understand a lot of the complexities and a lot of the kind of confounding factors. These are a couple of images that we went through correctly that radiologists have either missed the cancer or incorrectly have said that there was cancer. And exactly what we have been trying to do is go through down this checklist. I understand we might not have more time to go through that, but maybe over the panel discussion. I'll just close my talk with a couple of points that I think are important to share in this community. One is in the medical field, we need to work with doctors, as I said. That's why I believe the multimodal aspect, the multi-domain aspect is extremely important. We need to do responsible engineering. This is not like mobile app hacking and mobile app development. And we need to have responsible communication. Again, going back to my original premise of making sure that everyone understands when AI works and when AI doesn't work, what are the limitations, is extremely important. And it is extremely important because we need to keep in mind that we're affecting patients, doctors, hospitals, basically existing healthcare systems that are already built for the benefit of patients. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining our panel on medical imaging. As I think Tina alluded to earlier, we've got a great range of individuals along the clinical pipeline, from George as a research to kind of Joe as a practicing radiologist. So perhaps to start, we should probably kick off with a little bit of a reflection on where we've got to. If you think 5 years back when we mentioned AI in healthcare, you'd be met with like disbelief and shock and horror. Whereas just last year you had the FDA approve multiple applications. So perhaps each of you could just outline some of the accomplishments and key milestones that have been achieved within your respective sectors to date.
Okay, so maybe I should start. So I think what mostly has changed in the last few years was the technology itself has advanced quite a lot, both in terms of accuracy and performance and what you can do with the data. And we moved from this idea of human-driven feature engineering to algorithms learning all aspects of the things we want to predict. But I think the other part that has really changed is the tool sets themselves became very general purpose. While 5 years ago, when I was doing quite a lot of research, you would need to kind of create an algorithm specifically for every purpose. Now the learning system, the AI system, can learn many, many different tasks just by changing what inputs and outputs look like. And that really has revolutionized and sped up the pace of development quite tremendously.
So I'd speak from the medical side of things. And 5 years ago, when machine learning was generating for lung disease, which is what I do, features that predicted outcome in patients, we would train the computer to identify features that the radiologist was comfortable with. So these are things that we know exist, but haven't changed for 20 years. But people didn't want to hear anything beyond that. They knew that these features are important, and they just wanted the computer to quantify them. And I think what's changed in my field in the past 5 years is people are much more willing to accept new features, things that we can't see, but we know the computer says are important. So that mentality of searching for the invisible has actually become a lot more appreciated.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I work at Microsoft Research, so last few decades we've been doing machine learning for a long time. And really, I think what's breaking through now is kind of three things. One is the availability of data, the ability to marshal data. The other one is really the availability of huge amounts of computing via the cloud, the ability that you can spin up hundreds of GPUs just in a few minutes. And then, this revolution in algorithms. We look at deep learnings, but now we're looking at GANs, that Peter showed. It's really incredible. So it's really the the sort of those three things happening together, I think it's so exciting. And then in medical imaging, then it's a great example where we work with partners to really explore the art of the possible. But then the technology platform, the cloud platform, is really the key to be able to deploy this at scale in a secure way, where the hospitals own their own data, but can take advantage of all of the investments within hyperscale computing.
So adding to what my colleagues already have mentioned, I think the two important things also we can observe in the medical imaging is, first of all, it's democratization of AI, because if previously only highly educated specialists in fundamental maths could do that, now the tools that emerge allow almost everyone with technical background to leap into the area and start to experiment. And secondly, I think it's most important that theoretical research finally we see their practical results, and it's very important because people can feel it, can experience, and it improves trust in AI, and this is why I think it's very important for widespread of AI-powered solutions.
And I think another interesting area is beyond kind of the primary benefit of detection. You see a range of secondary benefits arise as well, such as, say, virtual radiologists democratizing access to specialist know-how globally. Can you share some of the interesting surprises that you've seen in your fields of additional unintentional benefits in a good way, perhaps starting at the other end of the line?
I think... I don't know. Can you hear? Okay, perfect. So maybe what I mentioned earlier, this positive feedback loop for research might be the most surprising benefit. That we're trying to impact patients because that's extremely important. We're trying to do research in the diseases. We're trying to do research in computer vision, but actually it falls all together. Finally, the missing piece of kind of automating this feedback loop, this positive spiral, is all the pieces are in place, and that was quite surprising for me on how much positive feedback we can give to the medical research community. I believe that will be a very strong driver moving forward in terms of the credibility and the positivity of what we're doing.
So I basically work not directly in the medical imaging, but rather in skin health and skincare imaging. And what I observe is that the technologies that we are using, they are not only, doing high-level diagnostics of skin, but they also can help people save up money on rather using multiple cosmetic products or different lifestyles, but we can provide some recommendations. So, the level of life will increase dramatically using these AI technologies.
The project we have in Microsoft Research Cambridge called Project InRI has been looking at auto-segmentation of MR and CT scan images in full 3D. We've been looking at a particular pathway within radiation oncology where segmentation is mandatory. And so being able to potentially help clinicians save time there is fantastic, because they can focus more of their time really on the patients and their families. What's interesting is, as we've gone through that process, is a side effect is that we all can automatically get a very accurate volumetric measurement of solid tumors and the different tissue types. And what that means is we can measure, for instance, over the course of multiple fractions in radiation therapy, whether the therapy is working, and that could mean that we can refine the dose calculation into something called adaptive radiotherapy, where rather than using the initial image for every fraction through the treatment, you can actually kind of really fine-tune that after every time. And then the other side effect really is we're looking at using medical images as measurement devices. So, revolutions in terms of the invention of the X-ray, PAC systems coming into the around 1970s, and now using AI, there's this opportunity where we can turn medical imaging from a pretty qualitative mode into a quantitative measurement technology. And that's something that we're working on, looking at sort of quantitative radiology and really the opportunities that then unlocks, which could have huge sort of implications. And so that's really exciting, focusing down very clearly on the clinical need, and then kind of working with the community to look at other opportunities that have much broader application.
So for me, I think when I used to think about AI a long time ago, it was some kind of mathematical magician in a dark room coming up with an amazing algorithm that was going to be successful. But what I found is actually data is so important that we really collaborate so much more than we used to. So I work with people from 10 different countries. So in addition to getting all that multimodal data from different groups, you have different people in each of those groups. So you have your computer scientist, your bioinformatician, your radiologist, your pathologist, your clinician. So I think analyzing this data in a much more complex way, it makes it much more applicable to patients, and you just cover a lot more of the spectrum of information that a patient's medical journey gives you.
Okay, so from my side, I think one of the interesting parts is people sometimes forget that predictions or diagnoses obtained from algorithms can be repurposed for different things. For example, if I can predict what is the likelihood of my patient having a stroke or something like this, that the same information might be very interesting to be able to predict, for example, if a bed might be available tomorrow in your department, or how am I going to manage this patient moving forward. And I really think that the interesting part is because these tasks now become very interchangeable and the algorithms are very general purpose, we can reuse these algorithms to be able to make predictions of things that people never thought about that can have massive amounts of clinical impact. If I now put on my research hat, I think the part that is interesting in research is because some of the fundamental tasks, such as auto-contouring, for example, now are pretty much solved. It forces researchers to try to answer the question that they were actually trying to answer from the beginning, right? So rather than saying, how can I auto-contour an image? That was never the point. You want to deliver better care. And because the fundamental tasks are now solved, I might regret saying this, you can start focusing on the more complex tasks that require composition of multiple tools so that you can do something much better with those tools.
And I just add to that, actually, in medicine, so much of our work is so narrowly focused. So cardiologists just working on certain types of heart disease. Even in lung fibrosis, people who do work in liver fibrosis don't often talk to patients with doctors who deal with lung fibrosis. But now this is actually making us, well, cross-pollinate's a funny word, but we're just dipping into everyone else's diseases, and all that extra information is actually incredibly valuable.
Brilliant. So as the industry becomes more comfortable with adopting ML, you see it being integrated along the workflow as a whole, so not only just doing detection, classification, segmentation, but then starting to kind of automate some of the reporting, from that prioritizing cases, doing the scheduling, and eventually integrating, hopefully, different elements of data such as the medical records and all the various genomics, phenotypic data, and so forth. How do you see your roles evolving over the next 2, 5, 10 years? And perhaps, Joe, we're all looking at you as kind of the radiologist on the front line. But how do you see, in general, kind of the sector evolving?
So I think in the longer term, a doctor is going to change in his role. I think a bioinformatician is going to be just as important to work side by side with a doctor. I think we've had a big group discussion in our team about this recently, and I think wearable technology and delivering better information from a patient's home environment to a hospital is going to be incredibly valuable. We know, for example, we're never going to get enough primary care doctors as we need in the UK, and collecting data continuously from a patient will be so much more valuable. That fine-grained nature will tell you much more about how sick that patient is, and we can preempt their arrival into hospital before they're actually decompensating and really unwell. So it's almost, if you can get away with removing the deficit of primary care and linking the home to the secondary care institution, I think that's what will change, and that will require continuous feedback of information to the hospital, and then clinicians acting on that information directly to the patient. So I think it's going to take in a lot more bits of data, and ideally, if the technology advances quickly enough, you'd have a better risk score for that patient for deteriorating based on their genomics, biomarkers, patient health record data.
Perhaps Kenji, at the front line of translation, moving it into the real world, how do you see your role evolving? Do you hope that you will no longer be needed in the future, or?
Well, I think Microsoft's been around for a few decades now, and the mission really now, the company mission, is empowering every person, organisation on the planet to achieve more. So we feel like our role is really to help the organisations that we work with to be able to deliver this type of healthcare. So we're really thinking and working with partners to understand these common problems across. So data liquidity, how can we build out cloud platforms that are secure and compliant at scale? How can we build tools? We've got a new automated ML tool that will automatically select a model and tune the hyperparameters for you. Those are the types of things that can benefit everyone. So I think, we think hard and work with everybody really to understand what we can do as a technology company. That means that our partners can really focus on, what they really need to do, which is understanding disease and being able to, deliver better healthcare. And so I hope, we'll always have a role, and that's what we've done for the last 4 decades. And so hopefully, we continue to do that.
Now, all that said, there's no shortage of hype in the industry, and I think one of my favourite papers I read of late was by UC Davis, where they showed that pigeons trained within 2 weeks could collectively detect tumours with 99% accuracy. It's one way to clean up London's streets. But I suppose, it wouldn't be a health panel if we didn't moan about data and regulation. So perhaps starting with the latter, on one hand you can say that the conversation around ML is focusing minds around adherence, standardization, reproducibility. But on the other side, it opens up a whole can of worms around liability, security, patient data, and the rest. How do each of you think about the regulatory hurdles, how to adopt, embrace, and modify and move forward? Perhaps starting with George from a research point of view.
Yes, of course. I guess it depends on how do we want to tackle market and what kinds of tasks we're trying to solve. And I think, we were discussing this earlier today during the other panel, and I think it is a mistake to target directly diagnosis or prognosis, things that will directly impact patient care. I think it's much more important that we start small, we start on things that have actually a tremendous impact but don't necessarily change care. For example, being able to know when the patient is going to be discharged, for example, from a department. That's not really going to change the way that they care for. Being able to have systems that can be used as safety systems, purely as a backup of what the clinician would do. Maybe the next level is we're going to start using them as alert systems. Maybe the next level we're going to start using them as prioritization, and maybe then triage, and only then actually do secondary reads, and only then as primary reads, and only then being able to make predictions that change care. And we have a lot of evidence to collect until we get to that point. So while I do believe that regulations need to evolve, and it's necessary that they do, I think it's also up to us, the people developing the technology, to find that pathway that suits you as a company to be able to reach market.
So I'd say in lung disease, which is where I work, there's a really interesting opportunity coming up now with lung cancer screening. So the NHS has put aside £70 million to pilot 10 lung cancer screening studies around the UK. And what that means is we're going to get a huge wealth of data in the years to come. Lung cancer screening, or for every 100 patients it screens, 2% will have lung cancer. But of course, the other 98 will have other diseases because of their smoking burden and their age. And we really don't know what to do with that information at the moment. Their cardiac risk, which is going to be quite high, their risk of COPD, their risk of emphysema, all these patients, we don't know how to deal with that information. But these lung cancer screening studies that will scan patients every year for the next few years will collect a huge amount of information, including genetic information, including biomarkers. So we can learn from that to inform what we infer from that data. But I agree, the data protection, the ways we share that data across these NHS sites is going to be very challenging. But I think it's something that the government at the moment is really looking to push.
I would say something somewhat controversial. As a startup founder, I always find myself battling against regulation. But I would actually say the baseline of regulatory requirements are actually there for general medical devices. The frameworks are there for doing something basic and not necessarily online learning or something esoteric, definitely not for personalized care or anything like that. But a baseline is there for general care. The problem that, potentially is lacking science behind it. So the process is okay, but the scientific analysis of, okay, is an algorithm ready or not, I believe that is potentially missing. And what are the weaknesses that a regulatory pathway has to uncover, and what are really the hurdles to overcome? Potentially is a bit overly driven by past kind of areas like the pharma companies and pharmaceutical pathways, not really AI. And I believe we need to go for larger sample sizes, understanding confounding factors, etc. And again, these kind of regulatory frameworks should really inform the market and should really inform all of the users. If they don't, then then you need to have another level of clinical evidence and another level of clinical evidence, and everyone's still completely unsure, and the regulators are unsure, and everyone's unhappy. So I think putting this kind of good information framework into the regulatory aspect will really be the key. So the framework is there. We need to put some solid science into it, and be open about it. That this needs to change, and clinical evidence has to be a bit stronger than in pharma, and it can be. So I would say that is the important part, which is basically meaning more work for my company. But I believe it is the only way, because what I do not want is another kind of not another, but a kind of like a AI healthcare winter. That would be the worst possible outcome. We need to get to good understanding fast and bring the science into the frameworks.
And data is almost like a double-edged sword for health, because as Joe alluded to, you have this rich, multimodal, high-dimensional data sets, but unfortunately it's often siloed, requires expert labeling, full of jargon and the rest. You've seen deep learning helping out a little bit with GANs, autoencoders, augmenting and improving the quality, and federated learning for trying to overcome or minimize the data sharing complexity. But how are some of you overcoming the data challenges, and how do you see we move forward?
Yeah. So on our side, as part of the London AI Centre, we are building a federated learning infrastructure that is able to be used to train algorithms at scale across multiple trusts at the same time. So what we're doing is you're basically taking hospital data within the trust, putting it into these big storage server that harmonizes, curates, quality controls the data, and that data is then accessible with an API from within the hospital itself, so the data does not leave the trust. And then what you can do is you can send algorithms into the hospital to big computers that we're installing locally, and are able to learn from the data locally in a way that is privacy preserving. And then the only thing that you do is you retrieve the model itself. And by doing this, you can avoid a lot of the governance issues that you have. You can bypass many types of regulations. And it does create a really interesting environment, because it's very scalable, in the sense that you could do this in 2 or 3 hospitals, but you could do this in hundreds of hospitals throughout the world with no problems in terms of legal barriers or any kind of legality issues.
We have a lung cancer screening study at UCL, which is going to scan 25,000 patients every year for 3 years. And one of the challenges we're going to have is our data will be incredibly homogeneous. 4 scanners are being bought, all the same model, all scanning the same patients in the same way. So we're going to overfit our models massively on that data. It'll be great for hypothesis generation, but one of the aims is to link with the other lung cancer screening studies to make our data as all-encompassing as possible, so our models can be generalizable, and that's going to be a big challenge.
Yeah, so we're working very hard around open standards. So last summer we stood up alongside our friends at Google and Amazon, IBM, and committed to standards in healthcare, particularly FHIR. And so we've since then been building out our Azure API for FHIR, so that you can stand up a cloud-based system that can sit inside your NHS firewall, your hospital or university firewall, that allows you to integrate data, EHR data, imaging data, genomics data. Normally it might cost $250,000, $500,000 to put that system up. Now, and take a year or two, now you can spin it up in about half an hour, and you just pay for the storage. So really being able to unlock that and really break down these silos of data, and really thinking about the cloud as an extension of a hospital data center or a university data center. It's not really this other thing, but we can design network architectures that sit on HSCN and N3, and so you can really take advantage of that scale. So real kind of commitment to the sort of standards that Matthew Gould talked about this morning in NHSX. But be able to do that at scale. We build that once, and then every university and every hospital can just deploy that in 30 minutes without having to build out all of their own infrastructure. And we know that universities are spending a lot of time, for instance, going through ISO 27001 compliance and NHS-IG compliance. We do it once for our data centers, and then it's available for everybody. So again, things we can do to help other people go faster.
So it's well known that medical data sets are usually very limited in terms of number of items. So in our case, as we work in skin imaging, we inspire people to oppose to collecting highly personalized images like selfies to collect skin image, because emotionally it's much easier just to make several pictures of your skin. This is one of the approach and strategy of data collection. The second approach is that we use generative adversarial neural networks to generate photorealistic images of skin with high resolution, which we use for data augmentation tool, and what is more important, for example, to show claims how your skin can look like with a special treatment. We can use guns as well. So it's just a special AI algorithm for that.
Well, things look promising. I suppose very, very quickly to close, are there any calls to actions or things you wish you saw less or more of?
Wow. I don't know how to answer that. I think a lot of formalization needs to happen in the UK, at least in terms of data access, knowing properly what the rules of governance are, what does it mean for algorithms to be used on these data, for legal frameworks. So there is a lot of work that is completely outside of the AI domain that needs to happen. So I think the biggest call to action is that even though the AI field and the research field and a lot of startups are happening at the moment and they're going at light speed, a lot of other fields need to catch up and they need to happen at the same time, because without these frameworks, the revolution is going to take too long to happen, and then we might actually end up with another AI winter, which no one wants, I think.
So I want to add up that I think that medical imaging really requires good infrastructure, because it's a big problem of sharing data, collecting, storing data, and I think there should be more actions in the synergy of hardware, firmware, software, and connecting this to internet so that you can really provide some digital services, which is quite important. I think it's the future.
Yeah, I'll second that. In terms of the cloud, is kind of designed to do that as a full stack. And with the compliance, and again, really supporting open standards, and the work I've been doing with various, research teams is really just pushing in the direction of these open standards, because we need to connect these systems and break down these data silos.
And I would just echo what I earlier said. I think it's extremely important that we have clear understanding of when an AI algorithm works or doesn't. So is the clinical evidence ready or not? What kind of clinical evidence we need? I think really when we have high enough expectations, that's when the field will succeed. And I'm really worried at the moment that we have low expectations.
And bring patients and the public along with us when we develop these things, because if people don't trust them, if people can't believe in them, what's the point?
Well, terrific. Please join me in thanking what I hope you agree was a fantastic panel.